Thank you and welcome, and thanks for joining us. My name is Angie Furman. I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society, and I'm helping out moderating today's session on monitoring user capacity on wild and scenic rivers and looking at some of the challenges and successes. I'm excited because today we've got a couple great presenters with us. We have Mary Ellen Emerick, who's a natural resource specialist for the enterprise program of the Forest Service. And we've got Sarah Lange, who's acting Pacific Southwest Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers program assistant, also with the Forest Service. So thank you, Mary Ellen and Sarah. Might have you each just do quick introductions of yourselves, and then we'll continue on.
Okay, well, I will start. And like Angie said, I work for the Enterprise Program, which is a Forest Service group, I guess you'd call it a group, where we provide services to forests that don't have the capacity to do some projects. And it's all realms of the resources. It could be, planning, it could be recreation, et cetera. So I work on a lot of user capacity work, not just on rivers, but in wilderness and outfitter guides and things like that. So I've been struggling with this for years and hoping to hear more from you all, and we can have a discussion at the end about other things you have seen and other successes you have had. So thanks for joining us.
And hi, everyone. Sarah Lange. I am, as Angie said, I'm currently acting in the program assistant role for the Region 5 Pacific Southwest Region Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers program, so for the state of California for the Forest Service. And in my normal duties, I am a recreation planner on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in Washington State, and have responsibilities related to our extensive wilderness system and the wild and scenic rivers on our forest. And I'm happy to be here.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Really why I wanted to do this presentation is really to share some ideas and some lessons learned around monitoring user capacity on wild and scenic rivers. But first, I also want to talk about the foundation behind it and what different types of monitoring you could be doing, how people are spotting trends and adjusting, and then some case studies where we've had both successes and challenges with monitoring. But I do want this to be interactive, so I'm going to be asking some things in the chat, and if everyone feels like it, I would love it if you would answer some of those in the chat. And then we'll have, at the end, we'll have a group discussion, hopefully share some ideas and also some of the challenges. And you may be coming from a whole different places than other people on this call, and we saw that in the poll. And so some of this information you may know already, or some of it you may be learning, or you may have a really robust monitoring program already, or you may be wondering how to get started. So I'm hoping that there's pieces of this that will touch everyone. So again, thanks for joining us. So the question that I ask, and I've asked this probably my whole career, is how can we effectively monitor user capacity on wild and scenic rivers? And there's many challenges, some of which you probably know very well. We'll talk about those, and nobody has all the answers. I'm not going to sit here and say I do for sure, but hopefully we can discuss some methods or thoughts that will help you think about your river or your role in monitoring use on it. And thanks to the folks whose names appear on the screen, there are many others that I didn't include, unfortunately, but they contributed suggestions and knowledge that really helped with this presentation. So just a quick refresher on user capacity, and I know I always have to go back to this. You might wonder, why do we care about capacity, especially if your river is really low use? Well, a little known fact, at least something that I had to look up, is that the actual Wild and Scenic Rivers Act doesn't tell us very much. It just says that top paragraph that you will address user capacities. And I always say fortunately or unfortunately, because it's a challenge for us, court cases have further defined that phrase to what you see here in the second two paragraphs. A user capacity, or what sometimes I like to call a visitor capacity, just because I think that sounds a little better, but user capacity is the right term, is required in a comprehensive river management plan, or CRMP. I think most of us can see there can be some challenges with these last two paragraphs. And you might be turning some of those over in your head. I think especially the explicit tie between the numbers of visitors and protecting river values. But the language doesn't make it really clear that we have to monitor the quantity and mixture of use. So just a little bit about outstandingly remarkable values. And each river has to have at least one of those. And if you manage a river, it'd be interesting if you pop in the chat what some of yours are. Sometimes these river values are included in the legislation that designate the river. Other times they're determined through the planning process. ORVs, as we call them, can be recreation, could be fisheries, it could be scenery, geology, or wildlife, among other things. And one thing people sometimes don't remember is that just because recreation might not be an ORV, it doesn't mean recreation doesn't occur on that river or that it isn't important. When you're monitoring user capacity on a river, you're ultimately doing so to ensure the quantity and mixture of use doesn't lead to adverse impacts on river values or ORVs, but also free flow and water quality. And I can see that Robin put it in the chat, some pretty common ones: recreation, scenery, and geology. So I'm going to ask you another question in the chat, and please feel free to type in there. How do you think river visitor numbers can affect free flow and water quality? And I'll talk a little bit about the definitions of those. You might think that water quality is about temperature and turbidity, but there's other ways that visitor numbers can affect that. So what are they? Does anybody have any ideas? So free flow means existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modification to the waterway. And then water quality is typically things like turbidity, suspended solids, connectivity, but also could be fecal coliform. There's a hint, turbidity, and others. So some of those things may not be affected by visitor use, but others can. And so some of the things that I've learned over the way, I definitely have fecal coliform, sanitation. Yep, those are all things that can affect it. There are some other things that I have also learned along the way is that actually walking in the stream can affect, and then dragging boats over salmon redds and even camping near salmon redds, human waste, like was mentioned in the chat, erosion from riverbank. And then I see also, recreational infrastructure like boat ramps. So there's things you might not immediately think of, but these are river values that you need to monitor and ensure that the visitor use is not affecting that. And there is a relationship between visitor use and, for example, the recreational infrastructure, right? So definitely things to keep in mind when you're doing your monitoring. It's not just the ORVs, it's these other river values, free flow and water quality. So here's a thorny question. What is the relationship between number of visitors and the condition of river values? And some of us have gone around and around on this. For example, if geology is your ORV, how are some ways visitor use can affect geology, that ORV? Can it or not? Something to think about. It can be really difficult to tie a visitor number to impacts to an ORV. There's some cases where it's more about behavior than about a number, but there are scenarios where it can be directly tied to the number. For example, some things that are pretty obvious are the number of encounters between groups, noise from larger groups, number of campsites, campsite proliferation, because everybody wants their own special spot. Things like social trails or user developed paths, however your agency defines that, can sometimes be tied to visitor numbers. But it's important to understand why those trails develop. Is it because there's a lot of people there and people are trying to get to their own private little spot? Or is it because people just don't like the existing trail or it's not a great trail? Here's an example of the need to look closely at why people are doing what they're doing. At one river, field staff noticed lines of people waiting for the bathroom. The easiest conclusion might be, well, we have too many people, we need more bathrooms. But upon closer observation, the staff noticed that people were holding clothes. So what they wanted was a changing room and not necessarily a bathroom. So not necessarily tied to the numbers of people. It's more about what people wanted for their behavior. They didn't want to change clothes. There weren't enough stalls for them to change clothes in. What they needed was this changing area. So a side note, and you may know this already, that facilities sometimes aren't allowed in some areas of Wild and Scenic River. So it's not as easy as saying we're just going to build a changing room. But it gives you some idea of how important it is to have that field staff or that local knowledge out there. They can notice those subtle changes. And it's also important to try to think critically about the relationship between the number and the impact. For example, we often cite vandalism as an indicator for user capacity. There's a lot of vandalism that means too many people. But this is usually really related to behavior. It's a behavior related impact that can be addressed in other ways, possibly through education, engineering, and enforcement. One of the other issues that makes user capacity really challenging is that there's very few studies linking visitor numbers to a biological resource impact. For example, what's the level of use that affects black bears? Is it 100 people? Is it 200 people? In that case, it might be easier to look at something else like campsite density as an impact to black bears. Another point, I like this quote from Dr. Haas on here because we definitely, some of us definitely agree with this, that there's this hopeful anticipation, there's a scientific formula, and unfortunately there's not. Another point that he makes in the article that I took this quote from is that capacity is not really determined. That's kind of a false hope. It's really decided upon using professional judgment and other factors. So if you look at the impacts on the screen that I have there, think about whether those are caused by numbers of people or behavior. Can it be both? It's not always so easy. And so when I talked about geology at the beginning, the rivers I worked on, the main impacts to geology from visitor numbers has been mostly have to do with climbing, recreational climbing, where people are making trails to these climbing routes. And you don't want too many people in one climbing route, so people will pioneer another one. So there could be impacts to vegetation as well. But that's the main impact I've seen to geology. There could be others, erosion, things like that. But generally, it's not as impacted by visitor numbers as some other ORVs might be. So here's a really quick, handy flow chart for thinking about starting to address your capacity, including monitoring. You can see the steps show you the process of determining what to monitor and where monitoring fits in. You can see that everything flows from desired conditions. Desired conditions, I'm going to read you a definition, which will sound kind of stuffy, but they are statements of aspiration that describe resource conditions, visitor experiences and opportunities, and facilities and services an agency strives to achieve and maintain in a particular area. But another way to think about it that might be easier is, what does protect and enhance for ORVs look like on your river? What's the unified vision you're aiming for? This will allow you to determine what's acceptable and what's not. You will also see it's important to know what your current conditions are. They may be really different than what your desired conditions are. I wanted also to briefly discuss how the visitor use management framework fits in with the steps for addressing user capacity and overall with monitoring. So some of you may be familiar with the framework. It was developed by an interagency visitor use management council, so including the Park Service, the BLM, Forest Service, NOAA, and other agencies, to provide this cohesive guidance for managing visitor use on federally managed lands and waters. And you can use this for any process, really. It doesn't have to be a river. It can be other things as well, a whole unit if you want. I'll provide a link at the end so you can see where you can find this framework. But you can see what we've talked about already. You build that foundation and then you determine your direction. And then monitoring is in light blue on the screen. But you can see it's an iterative process. Your monitoring should be telling you something. And you need to start at the beginning, determine what your existing conditions are, determine your desired conditions, and define your management direction. Some of these might not be included in your older river management plans. So wild and scenic river monitoring comes back to indicators and thresholds. If you're simply monitoring the numbers of people in an area, this can be an indicator, but without a threshold, your line in the sand, then you really won't be able to see if you're reaching your desired conditions. So indicators are resource or experiential attributes that can be measured to track changes in conditions. And then you can see if you're achieving or maintaining those desired conditions. And your thresholds are your minimally acceptable conditions associated with each indicator. And you might see, and you can still see sometimes, alternative names for a threshold, like standard or standard of quality. And those have been used and still are used. So two critically important things for thresholds are that even though we're calling them minimally acceptable conditions, they still represent acceptable conditions, not degraded or impaired. And establishing a threshold doesn't imply that nothing will be done before you reach that threshold. The example on the screen is for the Black Creek Wild and Scenic River in Mississippi. And you can see in that top table, we identified the ORV recreation that we wanted to protect, and then used an indicator for campsite availability, since overnight capacity is tied to the available sandbars there were to camp on. The sandbars vary depending on water flow and season, but we had done an inventory ahead of time to determine the average number that would fit a camping party. There's also a popular hiking trail that runs alongside the river, and hikers use the sandbars to camp on as well. So you have both floaters and hikers. As you may know, social science research shows that encounters while camping are more bothersome to visitors than during the day while hiking or floating. So we wanted to ensure there are enough sandbars for people to camp out of sight and sound of others. Also, past surveying has shown people like that remote experience they find on this river, and we wanted to keep that. So we established a trigger point, so we didn't wait to reach the actual threshold, and you can see it's 1 to 2 times a season of campsite sharing. And then you can see we focused on education as a management action instead of a more restrictive approach. And that's because right now and into the future, foreseeable future, there's enough sandbars to go around. There are something like 80 or something, and the use on this river is not that high. But if the situation changes, such as growing demand or the river flow changes the number of sandbars, we would have to consider other management actions. I've included the relevant monitoring action. You can see the overnight use of sandbars is what they monitor. And you can see it's only yearly during the high use season. And the reason for that is the low frequency is because it's tied to the amount of use on this river. Should the staff notice that use is going up, they might want to adjust this monitoring frequency. But we really wanted to keep it tied to that sliding scale, which I'll talk about in a second. Here's another example that's kind of similar with a little bit of a different approach. This is a BLM river, but also a special recreation management area on that river. And they also use the camp encounters, sharing campsites, and then they call it a standard instead of a threshold, but they have the 20%. So if you call it 20%, you are going to have to monitor a little bit more. And you can see their monitoring is pretty robust. They have a lot of things going on here. And so what they did in their potential management actions, and I didn't have room for that on the screen, is that they have 4 phases. So if they see a trigger point being approached, then they would initiate phase 1 and then go on through these other phases. And an example of that is the first phase would be designated campsites and developing a campsite map that will allow users to select the campsites that will minimize those camp encounters and competition. And then also a limit group size to 10 people per campsite. And you need a written permission if you had more than that. And then among other things. And then in phase 2, there would be a voluntary registration system for overnight trips. And then you could see on a web-based registration system, you can see what campsites are available, and you could plan your trips accordingly so that you're not close to other people if you don't want to be. And then in phase 3, you would have a mandatory registration. And then in phase 4, there would be a limit to overnight trips launching per day with this mandatory permit system. So you can see it's kind of a ramp up, and they actually did a very thoughtful look at what they would have to do should the use get higher. So coming back to capacity and capacity monitoring, it's really not the same as use limits. Use limits might flow from a capacity decision, but some rivers have much more capacity than is ever utilized. It's also tempting just to simply throw a number out there and say, we're done. But it's important to know why you arrived at that number after careful consideration of your desired conditions, developing your indicators and thresholds, and determining your management strategy. On the screen, you can see some numbers that are typically, some factors that are typically monitored. A lesson learned is that sometimes you want to monitor everything. And when it's best to just focus on a few things that can be used for several ORVs. What are the limiting attributes? What is the physical, biological, social, or managerial attributes that most constrain the river's ability to accommodate river use? So it might be more than one, but there's probably one that will rise to the top. So is it really possible to monitor on a more landscape scale? Probably not, but at the very least, you can consider what's happening in other rivers nearby. Here's an example from the 11 Point Wild and Scenic River in Missouri. So visitor surveys showed that people valued the remoteness, quiet, and relative isolation of this river, much more so than another river nearby called the Current River, which was more of a party river and more crowded. So if they wanted a more social experience, there were other rivers they could go to, and they went to this river for those specific purposes and experiences. Thus, the desired conditions, the indicators, and the thresholds were set to reflect this experience, and we set up monitoring that would assure that this experience doesn't change. Here's some examples of capacities that have been used on rivers. It's also important to consider if the visitor capacity should vary over time and space. For example, it might be useful to identify the number of people per hour versus the number of people per day, although your monitoring would have to change and be more robust for that, because there might be high use times that have a more significant impact on desired conditions. Some ways that some of these things have been monitored, and we definitely will leave some time at the end for people to type suggestions, but if you have some that I don't mention, I would love to see them in the chat. But some of the ways that some of this monitoring has been done when you're talking about this social aspect of it are remote cameras, trail counters, permit system data review, social media data, and crowdsourced data, as well as the obvious in-person monitoring. One thing important that I always try to remember about capacity is that it can be expressed as a range, depending on your agency, but generally it can be expressed as a range to account for ebb and flow of use. You don't want to have a huge high range like 100 to 500 people, but there is an ebb and flow of use, as you know, depending on holiday weekends, depending on weather, depending on snow, that kind of thing. So if anyone didn't hear a way that they're monitoring some of these things, please type in the chat, otherwise we'll bug you during the question and answer. And I do see in the chat about the arbitrary and scientific, yep, I totally agree with you, Bill, and that is one of the challenges that we have to face. I think we've improved some over the years, but definitely there is that element of kind of arbitrary and do reflect some of our biases. I think a lot about the social experience, whereas as a manager, if I see a lot of people, that kind of freaks me out, but sometimes people don't care. They want to go to that area. Doesn't matter if they have encounters with 20 people, for example. So, and I'm not sure about that. I think you're right, Robin, that they couldn't have a range on the Merced. So I have snuck in a few ranges in my capacity monitoring, but I'd like to hear what other people think about that. For my range, it's not huge. So, so that just depends. I find that a range is more realistic than having just a specific number, but there is that risk there, obviously, if the court has said they had to have a number instead of a range. So definitely you can see already that this is a controversial and challenging thing to do. And if you're writing a comprehensive river management plan, it's probably the most controversial piece of it with the public. So when you're looking at monitoring, there's two different places where you might be in managing your river. There's inventory, which is not strictly monitoring, and that's assessing the current or baseline conditions and informing development of desired conditions. This type of monitoring will focus on the question, what is the status and trends and associated impacts of visitor use? So establishing those conditions are your foundation. And then there's monitoring conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of management actions. And this is done after your development of desired conditions and focuses on the question, are current management approaches and actions achieving and maintaining desired conditions? So this is a picture of how things are changing over time. This is probably where a lot of you are, but if you're dealing with a newly designated river or with one that doesn't have a river management plan or has a wildly outdated one, you may want to inventory your existing conditions first. We'll talk about that. And I say you may want to, but really you should do it. Let's talk about this a little bit. Here's some items I've found to be fairly universal when I'm trying to develop my baseline condition. And obviously there's more or less. And even if you have a recent plan, this information can change as people change the way they recreate. It might be helpful after this inventory to develop a gap analysis. I did one for the Rogue which really looks at what's the difference between the existing condition of visitor use and desired conditions. This helps focus the monitoring as well. The gap analysis I did for the rogue wasn't your typical gap analysis of, what's the legislation say, what are some of the resources in the river. It really looked at visitor use only, and it looked at what kind of capacity studies had been done, are there campsite inventories, and known visitor conflicts. And that really helped me pull everything together to decide, okay, what's important, what don't we know, what do we know? It doesn't have to be and also one of the things that we sometimes forget about, or not forget about, but neglect because it's hard, is what are our visitors telling us? This doesn't have to be a formal survey or an open house. What are you seeing and hearing from them in the field? Here's a couple of examples of some visitor surveys that I think are interesting to look at. A side note that most of you know, there's a whole process for getting visitor survey questions approved, and this can be a really long process. So it's not something you can just jump in and do as an agency. The survey on the left for the Maine salmon recreational segment, I believe, talks about a different approach than some of us are used to. Instead of asking people, how many people would you prefer to see, which can be really subjective and challenging for a manager to work with, instead gets at how seeing too many people in that visitor's opinion would cause them to change their behavior. In the 11-point survey on the right, a number of attributes or potential management actions were listed, and people had to rate the importance of that value to them. This can help determine capacity and shape your monitoring as well. In the case of the 11-point, a majority of people, as I mentioned before, stated that remoteness, quiet, and natural sounds were important to them in the 11-point. So we looked at the current situation and determined if there was a gap between it and the desired conditions. And this way, the inventory helps shape our entire plan and our monitoring. And so the salmon survey is ongoing, and this is only a small piece of it. And if Chris Armitage is on this meeting, I'm not sure, but he can answer questions about it and the innovative approach they're taking there at the end. And here's another example here. This was an example of inventory as managers worked on developing a river plan, including the capacity and monitoring for several rivers on the Mount Hood National Forest. There was really little data on visitor use of the rivers, so staff wanted to do field work for a season before diving into the actual river plan. There were potentially a lot of different activities occurring on those rivers, as you can see from the categories above. So this form was developed for the field staff to evaluate the impacts and the severity of those. And so analysis of these fed right into the capacity and the monitoring. And this is a lot more work than some people can take on, but this forest thought it was important because of the level of use and the interest in some of these areas. Although some of these rivers didn't have a lot of use, some of them did. So monitoring also, as you know and have probably done before, helps you determine the trends in the area. So here's the relationship, the chart here between desired conditions, trends, management actions, and monitoring. And if you are managing a river, you can type in the chat if you feel like it, what kind of different trends you're seeing on your river that maybe you didn't see 5 or 10 years ago. And you can see that depending on where you are with your desired conditions, you can see either you're achieving them and maintaining them, you're achieving but not maintaining, a trigger is reached or not being achieved. And so that's when you have to implement your management actions or continue whatever you have decided. So an example from Black Creek, again in Mississippi, the past user capacity estimates referred to people in canoes. And the past there are typically 2 people per canoe. In the past several years, though, people are starting to use kayaks more often, single person kayaks. So it forced us to reconsider our user capacity. Before, we had number of boats encountered, and that really wasn't as accurate anymore because we were really looking at number of people in boats, if that makes sense. So you might also have a trail next to your river. Is that trail receiving more use than it used to? And is this affecting use on the river? Like we mentioned, are hikers and floaters competing for the same campsites? So I do see you're seeing more commercial and private use. Definitely a lot of rivers I've worked on, the use has really increased. Some of them it hasn't, but some it has. And the demand is just going up as people try to find ways to recreate and especially during COVID, but it seems like some of that's continuing. So I wanted to definitely talk about the sliding scale because it can be super overwhelming to think about how you're going to allocate staff and time to monitor on your wild and scenic river. It's always good. I always try to come back to the sliding scale. So the sliding scale of analysis is really used to ensure that the investment of time, money, and other resources is commensurate with the complexity of the area and the consequences of the decision you make. I don't worry as much about potential for litigation if you feel like you're doing the right thing, but it's definitely something that line officers or field managers or superintendents will be thinking about. So things I like to consider for monitoring are what the level of visitor use is when I'm thinking about the sliding scale and how long they can access the river, for example, the season of use. What's the risk to ORVs from that use? An example would be the user created paths. Yes, they might look bad to us, but are they really affecting water quality? How about scenery and vegetation? Are they really affecting that? Another example are campsite impacts. Again, there can be some specific impacts that are site specific, and we don't want to ignore those, but there may be more significant impacts to water quality for things like improper human waste disposal. That's not to say not to monitor and not to monitor for each ORV, but we need to monitor using the sliding scale and level of risk. The Merced River was mentioned earlier in the National Park Service system. That will have a very robust monitoring as it falls high on the sliding scale, whereas a lower use river with little access could have a lot less. Here's another high-end sliding scale example. On the Red River in Kentucky, visitation is very high. The level of interest is very high, and there are ongoing risks to resources. So the monitoring plan we develop takes into consideration staff capacity. You can see it's ad hoc, that's a little bit wishy-washy to put in there, but there are regular patrols that the staff does, and there's a lot of things they need to do when they're out there. But you can see there's multiple things to monitor. This will likely need to be adapted. This was the first year that we put this together last year, as they noticed changes in use and perhaps thresholds are exceeded. Here we focused on the destination points rather than visitation along the whole river, since crowding and impacts the resources are concentrated at those destination points. There's a lot of things going on at those places. We also included visitor satisfaction surveys, which in some places could be considered problematic because there's a challenge of approving surveys and the potential sampling bias that we might have. But the Red River Gorge has had this survey set up in the past. They've had several iterations of it and has a long history of public participation in the limits of acceptable change process. So we thought it was appropriate. Again, I'm not saying these are perfect, but it's what we did come up with, and we will probably the forest will have to monitor and adjust as they go along. And then here's another one from the Snake River headwaters in the National Park Service, but there's also multiple managing agencies on the river as well. And this has very specific monitoring for the river. You can see there's several items to monitor, and they take some expertise to monitor, not necessarily wait times, but some of the other things. And this is related to the risk to ORVs and the high level of use and interest in the river. Now, whether this is being successful, that's another question, but this was the monitoring plan they came up with based on the ORVs. So here's a low end, and I know at least one person on the call is managing this river, and this was the proposed monitoring for the Elkhorn Wild and Scenic River, which is National Forest and BLM. It has changed already. This was an earlier iteration, but it reflects the river on the lower end of the scale. The access is extremely challenging, plus a fire went through with severe tree mortality, and use was already very low to non-existent due to a lot of those factors, but probably will be pretty low for a while due to the tree mortality. And the baseline inventories were there, but kind of scarce, but showed no measurable impacts from visitor use. So the monitoring items are will be less, and reflect that level of use and risk. That's not to say that this won't be adjusted. Type and frequency won't be adjusted if the forest and the BLM begin to notice more use on the river. And we really tried to focus on things that could be measured fairly easily, but also things that would make a huge difference. And changes in land ownership would make a huge difference on this river. And then if there were new trails, for example, because there's no trails now, and there's no social trails, user created paths now. So we really wanted to pick the most important things based on what we were seeing out there. So you all could probably lead this slide discussion. There's a few things that are normally said about monitoring. And while I'm talking, I don't know if anyone will be able to guess this. It's in the West, and this is a river managed by the BLM. And if anybody has any ideas, type it in the chat. If you want a hint, let me know. We'll give you a hint. There's a lot of rivers, so you might not be able to guess this one. So common complaints about monitoring is that it's expensive, it detracts from higher priority work, and that it's time consuming. And are we even monitoring the right things? These perceptions are valid, but they also stem from some common errors. If you adopt a monitoring strategy with more indicators than you can track over time, and if you have poor indicators, like was mentioned in the chat, that result in monitoring data that aren't meaningful and aren't used to inform management decisions and actions. And another common problem is that you're developing monitoring that can't be easily repeated for people that come after you. These are all hurdles that are difficult to overcome. Not gonna lie about that. I'm hoping to share some examples, and maybe you have some success stories to share as well. Owyhee is really close. It's in the same neck of the woods, but a little bit more to the west, across the state line. I will keep that open and see if anybody else gets it. I'll give you some more hints as we go along. It's a river I worked on, so I'm partial to it. So what if you feel like you have no resources, you don't have anybody to monitor, you have no money, what are you going to do? Because we do have this mandate that we have to protect and enhance our ORVs. While any of these strategies on the screen take some time and effort, there's been some successes in using social media to at least determine the most popular areas, the times people go there, and some inferences about why they go there. For example, a review of Instagram hashtags. A review of Flickr photographs, some folks have used that, can give you some idea of where people go and can help focus your monitoring. And these two examples on here, though not from Wild and Scenic Rivers, show that some places are starting to look at crowdsourced data a little bit more. The photo on the left is from a national park and at Saguaro, and asked people to take a photo point photo. When I hiked back past here in the fall, when I was hiking the Arizona Trail, I was too cold to stop and take a picture. It was freezing, but you put your phone in there and you take a landscape photo and then you text it to them. This can help with essentially it could help with your vegetation impact information or for erosion of riverbanks. So there's still someone needs to collect that and analyze the data. And the one on the right is from a program called Crowd Hydrology. And they have stations that include a giant measuring staff and a sign that explains how passerby can contribute to the project by texting water levels to scientists. So those are kind of cool, interesting. Other places have signs that ask people to text the number of cars in a parking lot. And another way people have been successful is tying in with other river-related monitoring. It's a lot to ask, but if you're out there doing monitoring already, I've had a little bit of success with, for example, during wildlife monitoring, if people can look at campsites. Maybe they don't do the whole campsite rapid assessment, but they can at least tell you where they are and what's monitoring is already taking place in the area that can be used, like water quality monitoring. There's some rivers where non-traditional or other types of partners you might think of are being used. For example, on the Pere Marquette Wild and Scenic River, on the Huron-Manistee National Forest, they have Student Conservation Association and AmeriCorps interns, and they spend time at landings and launch sites. They're not technically monitoring, but they are talking with visitors and checking permits. So they at least are seeing where people are going on to the river and maybe hearing some of their concerns. And this forest has also developed maps of where people illegally camp, and those can be given to partners to check continued use of the area. And then the riparian landers do some monitoring as well, because that's in their best interest. And you can also use proxies. For example, for monitoring the Washington Franklin Wild and Scenic River, that's BLM National Forest, one early warning that they've picked was development of new trails into the area. So before you even get to the Wild and Scenic River corridor, there's places you can park and walk into the wilderness. And if you see development of new trails into that area, you can see if there's new or changing use, because getting to the Devil's Staircase, which is a very remote and very challenging hike, would take a lot of time. So if you can see these trails forming, you can at least get some idea that new or changing use is occurring. And then another example would be parking. If parking area is becoming full early in the day and people are parking on the roadside, it's pretty safe to assume the destination is experiencing high level of encounters. And then other areas have had success in having outfitter guides doing simple monitoring. I've had them do encounter data, for example, or reporting of invasive species populations. And some of you might have successes to share later on. I did see in the chat about, and I definitely agree with that, that sometimes you have results of monitoring that aren't necessarily even used to make any kind of decision. And it's super difficult to have these allocation decisions. And for example, to start a permit system, really hard. People don't want to do it. And it's politically difficult to do. So I'm not denying that aspect of this. And it's really something that I don't have a great answer for. So you have all this data, and how is it stored? There's probably a really wide range, from Excel spreadsheets to paper forms to electronic files. There's no one consistent way that I've heard people are dealing with it. I have been relying on a paper that the Forest Service Wilderness Information Steering Team is drafting up on data collection and storage. It's not final yet, but I can send you more information if you're interested in it. It really, in the Forest Service, people are using two main applications that I know of, and maybe you're using something different. If so, I'd love to hear about it. There's two ones, one Survey 123, which you may be familiar with, which has this interface for data collection tied to a geographic point. You can customize the survey with multiple choice, user input, etc. And then there's field maps, which I don't know a lot about, came about in, as far as I know, in January 2021. And it has this smart form functionality, but it's also geared around display of a field map and might be used for backcountry data. And I can get more information for you. And I really appreciate what I'm seeing in the chat about being, think of it as a long game. That's obviously true. So some things to think about with data, and I'm really interested about the other agencies, because all I know is the Forest Service of how you're dealing with your data and collecting and storing it. Are your security measures, if you're using it with volunteers? Are there existing surveys you can customize that you don't have to reinvent the wheel? And really, the backup is the most important. Speaking as someone who experienced an office fire where our whole office went up in flames, we had everything backed up, but of course the backup was in the office. So now that we're working more in the cloud, that probably won't be as much of a problem, but we lost pretty much everything and had to start from scratch. Not river related, but we had all this, a lot of data that was lands data, really these old 100-year-old papers and forms. We had all this stuff that was gone. So definitely something to think about is how you're storing your data. And so the lesson learned for me was definitely back it up and have some other way of referencing it. And hopefully we all have that now, but it's easy to just sometimes leave things on sheets and our own personal workspace. So now that I've gone over quite a bit of stuff, what I want to do is give you a little hint about that river. And it is near an area that saw an occupation several years ago. So that might help a little bit. And I guess that's probably all I should say about that, but I'll give you another hint if nobody figures it out. So what I want to do now, a Kiger is close. It's in the same area. It's one of the same. It's not the Kiger, although the Kiger is awesome. Not the John Day, but it's on the same mountain as the Kiger. And I would just probably tell you pretty soon. But anyway, it's fun to guess about it, I think, anyway. So I'm going to turn this over to Sarah, and she is going to give you a case study of a river that she works on and manages, and how they use visitor use monitoring data.
All right, thanks, Mary Ellen. Great. Well, I'm going to dive into a little story about the Middle Fork, Snoqualmie, and Pratt Wild and Scenic Rivers. I've had the the opportunity to be the team lead for development of a comprehensive river management plan for these rivers over the last couple of years. And I will elaborate on how we use some statistical model data visitation in our work to develop the CRMP. I will say that we are not yet in the implementation phase. So this is kind of thinking about how we use data to establish our baseline, inform conversations with an interdisciplinary team to identify management direction and strategies that we would need to include and develop our monitoring plan. So if you'll move to the next slide, that'd be great. A little context of the area I'm talking about. Middle Fork Snoqualmie River and its tributary, the Pratt, are located about a stone's throw away from the Seattle area. If you have a good traffic day, you might be able to get from downtown Seattle into the Middle Fork Valley in under an hour. And so that means we have a lot of visitors, and we are also proximate to some really sophisticated partners benefit from their input, specifically for the project I'm going to be talking about, the University of Washington Outdoor Data and Recreation Lab. And recreation is one of our ORVs for this river system, as well as fisheries and wildlife. And I think on the complexity scale, we trend a little towards the high end, mainly because of higher levels of use, but also some real concerns and interest from local tribes about potential conflicts with recreation and treaty rights and cultural practices. So next, please. One of the first steps that we took in our management planning process, at least when we got to the visitor use management plan, was to really break our system down into sub areas. And so we're looking at, kind of distinct chunks of the river system that have different levels of development and different patterns of visitor use. So for each of those sections, we were able to characterize kind of baseline conditions, what were the resource concerns, and have some variation in our monitoring plan across that whole system based on, level of complexity really in within the system. So for example, on the western side of the planning area, Scenic section 3, that's got paved road access. We have a lot higher frequency of staff and volunteer monitoring and presence in that area. We have a higher ability to collect data, to keep an eye on things, and that's really where a lot of our impacts are potentially concentrated. So as we move further upstream into the wilderness and the wild section, the expectations around monitoring are a little different. Some of the indicators are a little different. So I wanted to share that with you all. And I think we'll go to the next slide. Probably like many of you that have worked on these plans, we started out with kind of a hodgepodge of visitor information, and none of it was really complete. These rivers were designated by Congress in 2015, and we started planning in 2017. I think it might have actually been the end of 2014, but which is actually kind of quick. It seems to take us a long time as an agency to get it together on the planning front, but needless to say, we were not actively monitoring at the time of designation. And so in order to characterize, existing conditions at the time of designation, kind of have to look backwards and try to gather up what you have. We had, some rapid site inventories, wilderness site inventories from 2013. We tried to fill in the blanks with a more recent survey for dispersed sites outside of the wilderness and capture some areas that might have changed. We had car counts, a couple of years of car counts from electromagnetic counters that were installed on the roads. We had the National Visitor Use Monitoring, which is our Forest Service national visitor census, essentially, that happens every 5 years, but that doesn't give us site-specific data, right? It does kind of give us some basic demographics about our visitors to our forest, and it tells us, what the average party size for a car is on our forest, which gives us something to work with when we're looking at car counts in terms of estimating number of people coming into the valley, but certainly not complete there. We were able to conduct a visitor survey and intercept survey at some of the trailheads for a couple months. Certainly rich data there, but just a little sliver, snapshot of visitation. And we had a few years of ranger patrol data, something that our the Snoqualmie Ranger District on Mount Baker Snoqualmie is excellent about getting their rangers to all the rangers upload their observations and field notes into a kind of a cloud-based spreadsheet, which made it a lot easier for us as a planning team to kind of skim through that, look for hotspots and issues that we might want to pay more attention to. And then lastly, the trail use statistical model, which is what I'm going to elaborate on. And that was a tool or a data source that we were able to look at that really even retroactively estimated visitation trends back to the time of designation. So next slide, please. Excuse me. So we've been working for the past about 7 years almost, with the University of Washington Outdoor Recreation and Data Lab, a team of scientists there to test different methods of estimating visitor use based on crowdsourced data, social media data, and on-site data. And they've developed a pretty robust and reliable model that estimates trail-based use. And in the context of our river plan, we actually have trails adjacent to the river, each of the river segments. So for us, we could use trail use as a way to kind of get a proxy for visitation in the river corridor. That might not work for you, depending on your layout. But this model incorporates on-site data. Sometimes we have actual counters in place at trails, but there's other characteristics of the sites that are included in the data model. There's information that's gleaned and with methods that I could not even attempt to describe, but they are data scientists and they can kind of scrape the internet for this geolocated, geotagged photos that are publicly shared on platforms like Flickr, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as trail specific, trip reports that are shared on things like All Trails, eBird, and Washington Trails Association. And there's been a lot of research that kind of backs up and helps us understand the relationship between like number of trip reports or geolocated photos and actual on the ground visitors. But the third kind of category of data that feeds this model is really like a citizen science initiative. They call it Visitors Count, and that is a chat bot, which I will explain next slide. Here's a view of one of our trailheads, and you'll see a poster posted at the trailhead that invites you as a visitor to text a phone number. That phone number would be specific to a given trailhead. And it asks you how many cars are in this parking lot, or in the case of our forest, how many cars are in the parking lot, and cascading a mile down the road. But this works even outside of cell phone range. If you're out of range and you text this number, it'll go through when you're back in the range. And the chatbot part of this, after somebody has texted that car count that they've offered up, which is quite a good participation rate, really, they're invited to respond to survey questions. And these are survey questions that have been cleared through OMB. We've used them in intercept surveys, but the chatbot has some kind of artificial intelligence kind of to it. So if it doesn't understand the answer, it might ask a clarifying question. And it can kind of interact in a somewhat natural way with the visitor to complete a survey and collect information about observations that they've made in their experience, but they can opt out at any time. So pretty neat. Next slide, please. And so essentially this visitation model gives us a pretty reliable estimate of weekly visitors, and not just including the social media data and on-site data, but also incorporates information about the weather on any given day. We obviously know that influences use levels, time of the year, holiday effect, and trail specific characteristics, thinking about like elevation change and length of trail, distance from the city center, etc. Next, please. And so what this gives us is a dashboard that we can look at as the manager and kind of zoom in, and I will share a link to this so you can play around with it too. But this gives us a good estimate of change over time in these kind of what they call trail sheds. Sorry, next slide. We can also see, relative use levels of different trails. When you look at this graph on the left, you'll see the lighter line is the visitor statistical model estimate of use, and the darker line is actual on the ground observed count from infrared trail counters, which is like our gold standard for knowing actual numbers on a trail. In many cases, in most cases, really, they line up really nicely. The model performs really well. And then there are always like outliers, and then we work with the research team to kind of understand that and what's going on there. But it's been a pretty fun project. Next, please. Zooming in back into our planning area, we're looking back at the Middle Fork Snoqualmie Trail. We were able to get this decent, we felt pretty confident about this model and how it estimated use over time. And so we were able to see really not that long after designation in late 2014, early 2015, a sizable increase in visitation use, and it lines up with the paving of the road out to that valley. And we were able to factor that into our planning and estimate of kind of baseline use and considerations for capacity. Next. So how we're using this data, like I just said, really powerful tool to estimate baselines. That gave us a good grounding to have conversations with our interdisciplinary team and look at resource specific concerns that they might have, whether it's degradation of fisheries habitat or potential impacts with our conflicts with areas of important wildlife forage and trail use, etc. We were able to really have more informed conversations about what we needed to focus on with our visitor use plan, where we might need to dial back in our estimate of visitor capacity, or where we need to actually get more data and really collect that monitoring information. And so that is a little bit how we use the information in a very vague way. If you can go to the next slide, I will just hit on some of the kind of pros and cons of using this model data. I will say benefits wise, the scale of information is way beyond what we could do. And certainly the ability to go back in time and retroactively estimate use has been invaluable. Not a lot of burden on field staff to maintain equipment or analyze data. And although I will say that district is full of rock stars that do a lot of that on their own anyway, but and then this ability to actually engage the public in data collection is pretty neat. On the challenges side, this isn't a tool that's just going to run itself. It's not going to operate in perpetuity. It requires an ongoing partnership with the university. That means funding. It means support from leadership to continue that work. And biases in the data sources might be less understood than other methods. Like, I think we have a pretty good handle on who we're missing when we do intercept surveys or some of the more traditional methods. Social media data, it's a huge growing field of research to understand that, but there are biases that are harder to understand and predict. And then lastly, social media data availability changes. I think when we first started the research on this 7 years ago, Flickr was a pretty popular platform still. That's since dwindled. Things like Instagram have come up in its place. User preferences change, but also the commodification of data has changed over time. There are things that were available for open source, for the scientific community to look at that are now behind a paywall. And then really, importantly, ethical concerns about using data that's sure it's publicly shared, but maybe not with the intent to be used in a monitoring program, right? So there's a lot to chew on there, but it's an exciting type of data to explore for informing management decisions. I'm not sure that it's going to solve our problem for kind of monitoring in perpetuity when we implement our plan, but has been really helpful for planning. So with that, I will hand it back to Mary Ellen.
Okay, and I see a great question in the chat that we will hold on to until the end. I have about 5 more minutes, and then we'll get into 5 to 10 maybe, and then we'll have a short amount of time for some questions, because that is a great question about what would be the first steps in getting a program like this for our forest. Excuse me. So I wanted to have a really quick case study on adapting a monitoring plan. And sorry, I had to take a drink of water there. And Bill asked a question in the chat about has any use been, I'm paraphrasing here, has use been made, oh, I can't think of how to say it, but has use changed as far as how many people you can allow in a river because of monitoring? And this is a situation where this could have happened, and a different kind of river. This is the Wanaha Wild and Scenic River, and I live near this river, and so I hike it quite often. And so I reached out to the river staff to find out how they adjusted monitoring due to a natural event. So like I mentioned before, it's a wild and scenic river. It's in southeastern Washington near the Washington-Oregon border. And there's a wild segment that flows through the wilderness, the Wanaha to Cannon Wilderness. And then there's a part of the wild segment just flows through general forest outside of wilderness. There's a scenic segment that is entirely outside of the national forest, and it has an isolated parcel of federal land administered by the BLM, and also some state and private lands. And then you have to wonder why they bothered, but there's a 0.15 recreational mile segment that is in the Wanaha State Wildlife Area. And it is mostly the wildlife area and then some private land in the unincorporated town of Troy. And I'm telling you all this to show there's a lot of managing agencies on this river. And we had to, actually, when I was writing the CRMP for them, we had to understand their separate missions and how use in each section could contribute to capacity decisions we were making, or determinations we were making. So I worked with the forest, and I completed this comprehensive river management plan in June of 2015. 2 months later, the Grizzly Complex fire started and burned extensively in the river corridor. And this changed the access, it changed campsite availability, the ability to conduct trail maintenance, and in the corridor, and eventually recreation patterns. This event definitely made the monitoring have to change on this river. So some of the changes that the field staff, when they were monitoring after the fire, noticed is that there were some access changes due to a bridge being destroyed by fire. And from the east side, there's less multi-day trips because people can't cross the river anymore. There was no trail maintenance past the bridge area. It was difficult for staff to get there, much less visitors. And people started camping in really different areas, out in the open versus back in the trees, where the trees were still standing. Actually, the trail goes on the right side of the picture here. There's no trail on the left side. So you can see there's a lot of dead trees and people weren't camping back in the trees. And so there were new campsites that were created that weren't there before. The stock use of livestock, horses, has declined. That might not be entirely a function of the fire. And then there's trails that come down following tributaries from the rim that weren't really used as much before. And the staff noticed that people were using them more, probably in response to the fact that you could only go 6 miles from the east side. And people were trying to get away from other people. So here's the bridge that burned. You can see it was a pretty major bridge, and it used to allow access past that 6-mile mark of the trail on the eastern side. So people used to disperse for many miles through the river corridor, and allowed access to some of those trails that came down from the rim, so you could do these loop trips. For people that wanted to do that, it was challenging for people, but the main trail was fairly easy to walk, a lot of use there. When I say a lot of use, it's Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, lot of use. So you might see 5 groups of people, maybe, sometimes only 1 or 2. This river is nearly impossible to cross in the main use season, which is the spring. It's pretty hazardous, pretty life-threatening. So having the bridge gone was a big deal. In the summer, the river lowers, but hardly anyone goes in there because it's very hot. And it's one of the places I've seen more rattlesnakes here than anywhere I've ever been. So also poison ivy, can't forget the poison ivy. So this was probably the biggest impact to capacity, was the loss of this bridge. So what staff did with adjusting their monitoring, instead of going out and doing their typical campsite monitoring, their counter monitoring through the whole corridor, they adjusted by trying to disperse the use through education. So monitoring is actually easier now with no bridge because people are more confined. But another thing they did was try to open up the tributary trails as early as possible to disperse the users. They didn't change the capacity analysis because this is a low end of the sliding scale. And it's a rural area with limited season of use and low to moderate demand. But they did have a trigger point, and that was if people were parking in the town of Troy. There's a couple of little parking areas that are super small. You can maybe fit 4 cars maybe in there. And if they had seen those parking areas being consistently full and people parking down the road, that was an item they looked out for. And they would have had to adjust the capacity analysis and determine additional items. But right now, there's still enough capacity for the use there is. So what is the future? The things on the screen are all things that are going to affect the user capacity as the situation continues, subsequently the monitoring as well. The bridge is scheduled to finally be replaced this year, which will allow both visitors and trail crews to access those long neglected trails. The snags are still falling, but they're reaching that apex of falling. So that should moderate a little bit. And maybe people will start camping in different spots now. There's many other trends that are outside the control of river managers that could affect this river. So I want to say again that this is a low end of the sliding scale. In some high use rivers, you would have to have written a whole new capacity analysis if visitation continued at a high level and the monitoring showed impacts to the ORVs. In the end, the capacity for this river still far exceeds the current use. The staff had to evaluate the changes to the corridor in order to determine their management of visitors. So there's other rivers, obviously, that are much higher use that will have a fire go through them or other kind of natural event. And that will definitely be an uptick in the monitoring and the management. This one, it did affect the capacity. There were things that the staff had to do to monitor differently, but in the end, they did not need to change the capacity. So I wanted to have a little bit of time to talk about resources out there to help. These are things that have helped me. And what's helped me most are some of these things. For example, the BLM training, if you haven't gotten on this training, and we can probably put a better link in the chat, but it has a unit on user capacity. You do have to kind of check out, like put it in your cart and check out, but it's free. And it has all aspects of wild and scenic rivers. So it's been great. That's a great unit if you want to learn more about user capacity. Not necessarily, it talks a little bit about monitoring, it's more about developing capacity. The interagency visitor use management guidebooks, especially the monitoring guidebook, it has really helpful examples and case studies that you can pull from. The technical paper on the left-hand side gives you the steps for developing user capacity and a monitoring plan. And then of course, the River Management Society has many resources, including training and webinars. And then of course, there's rivers.gov. And I like rivers.gov. It has a lot of things on it, but they also have management plans from different rivers. And you can sort through those and see what might fit your situation, how people address monitoring. Some of the older plans really don't, but a lot of the newer ones do. So that's been really helpful. And then I was wondering whether to include this or not, because I don't know a lot about it, but I decided to, and I can find out more information if anyone wants to know about it. And one of the limitations of this is I think it's just Forest Service, but maybe other agencies have developed something similar. This is a GIS-based tool, and you can look at various layers of disturbances or events that have occurred in a wild and scenic river. And for example, I've looked at what is the past fire occurrence? What are the invasive species populations? And if you're interested, I can find out more about it. I've just really skimmed the surface of it. But for that baseline information, for me, it's been really super helpful. So I thought I would throw this in, even though I'm not very knowledgeable about it. So it is, we don't have very much more time, unfortunately, maybe about 10 minutes or a little bit less. But I really wanted to spend a little bit of time, if folks are willing, to bring forward anything that you might have been thinking about. How can we continue to share some of this information, knowing that we're all from different agencies and we have different methods and different guidance? What are some of the needs people have? And what programs have you worked in that have had success? And how do you overcome that kind of fatigue from wondering, as some people have put in the chat, if all you're doing is really going to change anything or help anything? And then finally, are there other resources we didn't mention that are helpful to you?
Also, like Sarah's comment about rattlesnakes being an effective approach to managing river capacity. And I'd have to say, I've heard the same about poison oak.
And grizzly bears.
And grizzly bears.
So, yeah, go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was curious if anybody I know, sounds like Bill had to jump out of this, but he posed a pretty good question about, if anybody had experiences with management decisions being made based on the monitoring data. And I was curious if anybody had anything to share on that. Or maybe some wish list items if you haven't had the steps taken yet.
Yeah, I think you summed it up a lot better than I did. I was kind of fumbling for words there, but I think as far as what I've done is I've helped forests, and when I say forests, it was a little bit forest centric because that's the work I'm doing, but put together these monitoring plans. But I'm really curious to know what happens after I leave. Does anybody actually, what's the successes? Like, have you had to go ahead and change your allocations? Have you had to change your monitoring in response?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think as a participant, many of us may be in the starting stages of the management plans. So I don't know if too many of us have examples. I certainly don't. We're in a river use management kind of pre-planning phase right now for two of our rivers that are eligible for wild and scenic status, but this has been a really helpful training to help me better understand, not training, but discussion and information on helping me understand kind of the processes, and that, I'm not starting from scratch for any of this stuff.
What are your rivers, Julie?
So I'm at Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore in Michigan, the Lower Peninsula, and the Crystal River and the Platte River are both eligible.
Oh, I grew up in Michigan, so I've been there and it's gorgeous. Yeah. And there's wilderness there as well, right? So I'm not sure if the rivers are in the wilderness.
Yeah, the rivers tend to be out of the wilderness in part because pre-existing commercial use has been going on them for longer than the wilderness designation, but there's some wilderness very close to the bank sides on at least one side of the Platte. So there are some general concerns.
I think what I've found in developing, your capacity and your river plan is that most specialists will only work on one wild and scenic river plan in their whole lifetime. So getting the specialists up to date with what is this even project about, what's needed from them, how can they develop these indicators, and that's where the River Management Society has been really helpful. They've put on the workshops, and that's been really good, but it's overwhelming to people when they first get started.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was thinking back another comment that I think it was Bill made in the chat, but about that sense that sometimes these indicators that can feel arbitrary, and maybe they are arbitrary, but something that I know that we've made a conscious effort to do, and I don't know if it'll make a difference on that front, but was to really provide the rationale and list our assumptions for indicators and our assumptions about the relationship between visitor use and resource impacts, and just line that out in the plan, so that we're really, there are assumptions that are being made, and there's probably biases, right? That's hard to avoid. But if you could be really explicit and transparent about, the rationale for these things, I think it's a good practice. It helps the public understand, and it helps the public, more effectively argue with you if they think it needs to change. So I just wanted to offer that.
I just want to say a huge thanks again to Mary Ellen and Sarah for this presentation. I know it's not always like the easiest topic to address, and I think you did a great job of providing a lot of examples